here. Is there anything you've got in memory, photographs, anything you brought? Share it with these folks. That's why they're here, so that when they leave, they can have their past at least brought forward for them. Go ahead.
My mom's got everything there, so.
Okay.
I wrote things down because we had many stories shared in our family, but I thought there should be some chronology to it all. So I've just written a few things down. It seems strange to hear this property referred to as the Dodge Lodge because we grew up knowing it as Naoshi. It was built by a wonderful woman, Helen S. Ford, who had such love for this piece of land. While visiting friends in McGregor Bay, she decided to purchase property on the Manitoulin, and her search led her to Maple Point. Mr. Turner of Little Current referred her to my grandfather, Ed Drolette, to oversee the completion of building the lodge and outbuildings. I don't think he was here right at the very beginning of construction. My grandfather was a master carpenter, had worked for a logging company, and could make or fix anything, and was a very honorable man. Mrs. Ford visited my grandmother at her home in Little Current and asked her if she too would come to work for her. She told my grandmother later that she knew immediately upon walking into her sparkling clean home with the good smell of freshly baked bread that she was the person she wanted to work for her. She welcomed the entire family. My Aunt Edith, who would have been about 18 at the time, became a server and helped my grandmother clean. My uncle, Dick Drolette, and a cousin, Frank Drolette, also worked here. My Aunt Laura was married to Joe Lowe of Killarney, and they would come by boat to visit and often bring whitefish to be served to Mrs. Ford and her guests. My mother was still going to school, but she was here on weekends and during the summer. It was a very exciting time when Mrs. Ford arrived at Maple Point, driven by her chauffeur, accompanied by her friend, Miss Allen, who stayed the entire season. And they always had another car laden with supplies. She would bring her sewing machine and much fabric. Even though she was a very wealthy woman, she liked to sew. And she made many of the curtains, cushions, and bedspreads for all of the rooms in the lodge. In fact, in 1970, I brought my mother here to see the place, and it was being looked after by a caretaker, and the original things that Mrs. Ford had made for her quarters were still there, very faded and very tattered. It was a very nostalgic moment for my mother. It was also very sad to see the place in such disrepair because it had once been such a beautiful spot. There was a mutual respect between Mrs. Ford and my grandparents, and they thought she was absolutely wonderful. This was a very special place to work. She would make suggestions and then say, "So what do you think, Ed?" She always asked their opinions and asked advice. She visited my grandmother every morning to discuss menus and supplies that might be needed. She always called my grandmother Mrs. Drolette, and except for family, so did all other workers and guests. She was a very gracious, generous lady, and as my grandparents put it, it was the ideal place to work. They thought she was very special, and she treated them with great respect and appreciation for the work that they did for her. She always came with a friend, Miss Allen, who stayed the entire season. And each year there was a Dr. Loudon who would visit for a couple of weeks. Her sons and their families usually came for visits. Her husband, who I found out today she was divorced from, but he must have had a shipping company or something, because once or twice a season, one of the big shipping boats would stop in the channel, anchor. My grandfather would go out, bring him in, and he would have dinner and a visit and be gone. She really didn't have a lot of company. She really enjoyed the place, but didn't do a lot of entertaining. I'm not sure of Mrs. Ford's age. My mother was very young, and she said she was an elderly lady when she owned Naoshi. But her family felt she was in the wilderness and did not have the same fondness for this place as she did. They worried about her being so far away, and they urged her to sell this place. And eventually, she did sell it to the Dodge family. I understand that Danny's name is on the deed, but his mother seemed to be in control of this estate. Working conditions changed for my grandparents. They loved the place and enjoyed working here, but they seemed to be treated by Mrs. Dodge with suspicion. My aunt and uncle from Killarney were no longer welcome to visit because she didn't like their boat. Supplies were doled out, and anything my grandparents needed to run the place was questioned. An example is matches. With Mrs. Ford, you always had unlimited supplies. With Mrs. Dodge, she would give my grandmother a handful of matches and tell her to ask when she needed more. My grandparents really liked Danny Dodge, and they did say they felt sorry for him because his mother was so domineering. He was a very likable, pleasant young man, and they also really liked the woman that he chose for his wife. He liked to hang out with the men. He was the only one who called my grandmother Mrs. Drillette once they took over, and one day he asked her if he could please eat with the guys, because they lived in the building that we had dinner served from. He always raved about her cooking and would thank her after every meal. When the Dodge family bought Maple Point and my grandfather was informing them about the property, he explained that unused dynamite used in construction was buried for safety, and it was never to be touched. Danny seemed to have a fascination about it, and several times he questioned my grandfather about the dynamite. My grandfather, who had a very short fuse, would get cross, and my mother remembers him saying, "If that fool touches it, he could blow us all to kingdom come." And I'm sure that was sprinkled with a few curse words that he was known to use. My grandparents were not happy working for Mrs. Dodge. They knew they could not go on working here, even though they loved the place, because the atmosphere was very different from when Mrs. Ford owned the place. When Danny married Laureen, my mother said she wanted some of her friends to work here. I don't really know if my grandparents quit or were let go. I found out today that they were let go. When news of the tragedy hit Little Current, my uncle and cousins were all in boats helping in the search for Danny Dodge. My grandparents felt terrible because they had always liked him very much. And my grandfather continued to work until he was 84 years old. He was an avid sportsman and fan until the day he died. And